What could drive a person to madness? These are surely the questions researchers had during their case study of an unnamed patient. For the purposes of our discussion, we'll give this patient a nickname Al. See, Al's case is an interesting one because Al was, by casual definitions, just a normal guy. Al was a 43-year-old husband and father. In the 4 decades Al has been alive, he showed no signs of any psychotic symptoms. However, after a traumatic event where several of Al's fingers were severed, he began to experience hallucinations. They started out simple, shapes and rocks appearing to tumble towards Al. However, they gradually became more complex. Eventually, Al would begin to see hallucinations of burning rain, and in one instance, a tall stranger dressed in black, riding atop a horse who would come to threaten and ridicule him. This change of mental state almost sounds like it should be impossible. How could somebody live a completely normal life and then all of a sudden develop severe psychotic symptoms? Well, I intend to answer that question and many more in today's psychoanalysis of Jinx. Class, welcome to VGOLOGY, where we dissect the psychology behind our favorite video games. Make sure you check in for attendance by hitting that like and subscribe button. Be advised that this video will contain heavy spoilers for the TV show Arcane, so if you haven't seen that show yet, make sure to check it out before you watch this video because that show is absolutely amazing. Okay, so today I want to do a deep dive on the character Jinx from the game League of Legends and answer the question, what caused Jinx to go crazy? For this discussion, I think it's important to clarify two of the terms that will come up often. These terms are psychosis and schizophrenia. Psychosis is a symptom that refers to losing touch with reality, whereas schizophrenia is a mental health condition that affects thought processes, emotions, and behaviors. People who have schizophrenia also suffer from psychotic symptoms, but not all people who have psychotic symptoms suffer from schizophrenia. In Jinx's case, it would appear that she does have schizophrenia with severe psychotic symptoms. See, to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, you have to experience 2 out of 5 schizophrenic symptoms for a duration of at least 6 months. These include delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, catatonic behaviors, and negative symptoms such as emotionless behaviors. For a diagnosis of schizophrenia, at least one of the 2 symptoms must be one of the first 3 symptoms on this list. In Jinx's case, we find that she doesn't just exhibit one of these symptoms, but all 3 of them. We see Jinx display erratic behavior throughout the show where she speaks in a disorganized way.
I didn't lose her! They took her! She was there for me!
Additionally, as we see clearly in Arcane, Jinx suffers heavily from hallucinations of her dead family members. Finally, Jinx also exhibits delusional behaviors. Delusions differ from hallucinations in the sense that they are not sensory-based. Instead, they are false beliefs that are held by a person. We can see this evident in Jinx throughout Arcane, where she constantly believes that Caitlyn is out to get her and that Vi is replacing her with Caitlyn. So we've established that Jinx suffers from schizophrenia. The question now is, how did she develop it? Well, you see, studies have linked traumatic events to an increased likelihood of developing psychotic symptoms. In a study by Robert Butler and his colleagues, 20 combat veterans with PTSD were compared to 18 combat veterans without PTSD. The PTSD group were found to have psychotic symptoms at a greater rate. Specifically, this group was more likely to experience hallucinations, delusions, and bizarre behaviors. This is similar to what happened in the case study of Al at the beginning of this video. Al developed psychotic symptoms due to the traumatic event of losing his fingers. However, there's more at play here that will lead to these symptoms developing. See, Al had a low education level and belonged to a low income class. To make matters worse, one of his children required repeated surgeries due to a medical condition. Al harbored an extreme bitterness towards the unavailability of support for his problems and felt like he was being exploited by his previous jobs. These issues would cause Al to feel shame, guilt, and worthlessness. After losing his fingers, researchers would describe Al as hyper-focused on that moment where the accident occurred and wishing he could go back to prevent it. In their conclusions, the researchers would describe the relationship between trauma and psychotic symptoms as the following. There is a relationship between the pre-existing cognitive schemas of the individual, thought patterns emerging after the traumatic event, and biological triggers. This relationship, best described as a maladaptive cognitive processing style, culminates into feelings of shame, guilt, and worthlessness, which are unrelated to similar feelings which emerge during trauma recollection, but nonetheless act in a positive feedback loop to enhance symptom severity and to keep the subject in a constant state of psychotic turmoil. So, simply put, pre-existing thought patterns such as shame, guilt, and worthlessness work in a feedback loop when recalling traumatic events. These negative feelings are constantly being fed and intensified every time the trauma is remembered, which keeps the subject in a constant state of madness. Wait, hold on a second. Shame, guilt, and worthlessness. Doesn't that sound like somebody else? From childhood, Jinx struggled with feelings of shame and worthlessness. She was always being called a Jinx by the people around her in her life due to her tendency to mess up. When she tried to overcome that, she ended up causing the death of most of her family and called a Jinx by the one person that she loved the most. This would cause her to experience intense feelings of guilt. The fact that this event happened during Jinx's childhood is also a significant factor. In a meta-analysis by David Popovic and his colleagues, they found that children who experience significant trauma are 2.72 to 2.99 times more likely to develop some form of psychosis, including schizophrenia. In episode 8 of Arcane, Jinx has to undergo Shimmer treatment in order to save her life. This treatment appears to worsen her condition. Shimmer is a type of drug in the universe of League of Legends. Real-life studies have shown that the use of certain drugs will increase the likelihood of developing symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia, especially in those that are vulnerable, like Jinx. Some drugs like cocaine can even intensify existing psychotic symptoms. Shimmer probably acts in a similar way to this. We already know that Jinx fits a category for somebody that is highly vulnerable, and the Shimmer treatment only worsened her condition. Finally, I want to briefly talk about another psychological process that Jinx is going through throughout the show, specifically the process of grief. The Kubler-Ross grief cycle was created by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross while conducting near-death studies of terminally ill patients. She outlines 5 stages of grief that a person goes through. These stages can occur in any order and vary from person to person, but essentially the stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. In Arcane, we can see Jinx display behaviors belonging to each of these stages. The denial stage usually takes place when the source of grief occurs and is typically very short. The stage is characterized by shock or speechlessness, where the mind may try to convince itself that nothing happened. We see Jinx go through this in episode 3 when she finds out that she caused the death of her family.
I was saving you.
The second stage is anger, and as we clearly see throughout the show, Jinx has a lot of unresolved anger and resentment inside her. I think this scene captures it perfectly. The third stage is bargaining, where a person holds on to a irrational hope. They make compromises or promises in an attempt to get back to where they were before.
Make her go away. Please. Send her on her way in. And you can have powder back.
In Jinx's case, we see her try to bargain with Vi in order to get back to who she was before. The fourth stage is depression, when somebody begins to feel that something has been lost, but hasn't come to terms with it yet. In Arcane, we see several scenes where Jinx still struggles to accept what happened, and is still clearly haunted by her past.
One of those firelight wackos was a girl. With pink hair.
The final stage of the grief cycle is called acceptance, where a person comes to terms with their new reality. In the climax of the final episode, we see Jinx finally come to terms with everything that has happened to her, and she finally accepts her new identity.
So, here's to the new us.
Throughout the course of the show, Jinx mourned the loss of her innocence, of her childhood. At the end of her grieving process, she was finally able to accept her new reality. That powder was dead. So, let's recap. Jinx suffered a traumatic event which caused her to develop psychotic symptoms. Due to the fact that the trauma happened during her childhood, the chances of her developing schizophrenia were multiplied. The Shimmer treatment that Jinx went through worsened her psychotic symptoms. Finally, Jinx was working her way through the grief cycle and in the end, embraced her new identity. And that's what drove Jinx to madness. Okay Jinx, you've been diagnosed. As always, thanks for checking out VGOLOGY. I want to give a special thanks to VGC2 for providing the gameplay footage used in today's lesson. If you guys enjoyed the footage, then please go check out their video and drop a like and subscribe. I'll be taking any questions and recommendations in the comments, so let me know who else you guys want to see in the therapy chair below. Class dismissed.